Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today's discussion is devoted to BRICS, and I call it an opportunity or a problem or a challenge to the United States. The whole world is now speaking about the recent summit that just closed in Rio de Janeiro of the BRICS group. And most trivial comments are about whether Chairman Xi came and didn't come, and why he didn't come, and Putin came or he didn't come. And this is all trivia. Of course, it has no significance. But let me put this discussion in a more historical context, not so much even economic one. What does it mean, the arise of this group of countries? Does it mean a change in international relations? And what exactly does it mean to the United States and to Trump's policies in terms of U.S. place in the world as it is shaping up? Well, it is hard to define what BRICS is. Some call it an alliance, some call it a group of countries or a club. I would define BRICS as an alliance of the willing of those countries who want to pursue their national interest and who don't want to be bound by any particular rules or regulations that are coming from the former imperial powers, that is to say the Europeans and the United States. The thing that holds all the BRICS countries together is what is often called a multipolar world. That's a kind of a system where there is no one binding superior authority, as it has been in the years since World War II up to the present day, where we lived in a kind of an Atlanticist world, which was dollar-based, Bretton Woods-based economic regime, and dominated by the globalist elites, and specifically by those of the United States. Now, that world, as we all know, is coming to an end, and BRICS is an attempt to define something new. So what is it then? Well, the statistics is that today BRICS countries' GDPs amount to 40% of the world output, and its population is more than 50%. But not even that is more important. I think by far more important is that these are the countries that are growing and growing very fast, both in terms of population and in terms of economy. For example, the new member Indonesia just claimed that its goal is to reach 8% GDP growth per year. Another coming up member as of January next year is Nigeria, a key country in Africa with a population of 200 million. 200 million, that's more than Britain, France, Italy, and Spain combined, or close to it. So this is the changing times. You have enormous, explosive growth of population and of economic development of these countries. So geographically, BRICS is on the one hand very, very diverse. On the other hand, it is quite different, and that is also a challenge for them. At the same time, it is to their advantage. So let me explain. The original BRICS countries, there were 5, which is of course Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now they've expanded to 10, and more are coming, and that includes 3 countries in Africa, Ethiopia and Egypt, which is again the north and east of the continent, and with the addition of Nigeria, rich in oil and in growing and booming economy, plus South Africa, you have really all 4 corners of Africa are members of BRICS, which means that they may exercise a political and economic influence on their neighborhood, which, as I said, both in the north, in the south, and in the center of Africa. If we take, for example, a relatively undeveloped country like Ethiopia with a great potential because of its strategic position next to the Gulf, next to the Central African countries, it can get pretty much anything it wants and needs without Europe. And that is the key. It can get grain, which it does, from Russia, weaponry from Russia. It could get textiles from Asia, from Indonesia, from Vietnam. It can get high tech from China. In other words, for the first time in history, the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America can get anything they want without the West. And that is something that is fundamentally new and didn't exist even 25 years ago. When Huntington wrote his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, and there are many, many interesting ideas of it, but one of the key ones was indigenization. And Huntington argued that in the world which he called the West and the rest is raising their hand, is wanting to become a part of the bigger whole. And to put it in the terminology of the early 20th century, to have a place under the sun. Now, as you recall, at that time, it was Germany that wanted to have a place in the sun by having more colonies, and the British wouldn't let them, and that led to, among other things, to World War I. So now we're in a very important historical period when there's a kind of a condensation or relative diminution of the West compared to the rest. And that rest is uniting in a variety of ways, but one of them is this alliance of BRICS. Now, why is it a challenge? It's a challenge because what they're trying to do in BRICS, and specifically it started under Russia's presidency last year, but it continues at the current summit, is to create independent of the West institutions. Independent of the West. So they're trying to counter the SWIFT system from which Russia was expelled, and that contributes enormously to Russia's ability to circumvent the sanctions and the domination of Western currencies. So they've created their own system of payments, which is based on national currencies. And what the financial specialists are saying is that they do not want to create one currency to replace the dollar, like, for example, yuan or ruble or any other one. They don't want to go through that model of creating a euro or something similar. They want to create a basket of currencies that are in a certain corridor, have a balance that could be changing, but they're backed by gold, and that are a key ingredient in the system of payments, and a system of payments that is independent of Western pressure. So that's the idea. Now, it went even further last year and continues today with the creation of the Development Bank, whose goal would be to finance various developmental projects. They also are creating a fund to come to the aid of local currencies in case of emergency, such as, for example, if there is an emergency in Iran, then they could borrow from this fund in order to overcome the current exigencies. Or, for example, if there is a sort of a lack of grain in a country that's dependent on grain imports, such as Ethiopia, that's the fund that could step in. And there are many other things that I don't have time to go over, including what President Putin said: there'll be a song contest, and there is a tax secretariat that is going to coordinate the issue of taxes and exchanges and surpluses and deficits and trade balances, etc. But in other words, this is emerging as not just a club and not just as an alliance, but it is really beginning to look like an organization. That is, organization devoted to trade first and foremost, and to development, trade and development. And that goes very well with the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, and with the Russian objective of freeing itself from Western sanctions and Western restrictions. Now, all of that may appear as a challenge to the United States. Especially because when we compare the Western world and the BRICS world, what is absolutely apparent is that the populations in the West, especially in Europe, are declining, and the economies are shrinking. Not dramatically so, but still they do. In France, in Germany, in Britain, in Italy, the birth rates are close to I wouldn't say catastrophic, but close to it. 1.2, 1.3 per children per woman. In other words, there's a kind of a economic, demographic, and political recess or decline of the Western countries. And at the same time, expansion, both demographic, political, economic, of the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So all of that constitutes a problem or a challenge to the United States, especially if it chooses to fight it. And that's why it's so disturbing when President Trump made some utterances that could be construed as fighting BRICS and his threats about de-dollarization. As Vladimir Putin has explained so well, the de-dollarization is not the goal of BRICS. De-dollarization happens because of the US restrictions and threats and freezing of assets and other things. But nobody objects actually to trade in dollars as much as with other currencies. Dollar can have its place next to yuan and rupee and ruble and other currencies. Nobody's objecting to that as a principle. It's only when dollar is weaponized and is used as such that the countries have to resort to some mechanisms to overcome that. But now let me get to the most important point, and that is my argument that this rise of BRICS can be, if there is a correct and proper policy, can be an opportunity to the United States. Instead of fighting it, if there are some indications that the U.S. is willing under President Trump to retreat from empire, to retreat from Atlanticists, and to Atlanticist approach to globalization, meaning that the rest has to obey the West. If Trump is ready to move in that direction and abandon this kind of imperial outreach, then there can be significant opportunities for the United States. And there are some indications that Trump is feeling out in this direction. One of them is his departure, probably quite soon, from NATO and from support of Western Europeans. The logic of America first is that America is tired of paying for Europe. They are mature enough and rich enough to pay for themselves. Hence, Trump's insistence on 5%. And if they fail, this gives him an excuse to abandon NATO altogether. But I think it's more than that. It's not just retreating from Europe because Europe is expensive to maintain. That's part of it. That's part of the retreat from the empire. Another part simply is that the pivot to Asia that had been already in the works for the last 20 years or so in the United States means that Asia is simply more important strategically for the United States, specifically its relationship with China, its competition with China, its trade with China, and arising up to that is, of course, India and the relationship with Russia. In other words, for the United States, these three relationships of the three BRICS countries is by far more important than the relationship with bankrupt Europe that cannot live on its means and is borrowing in its pretty much as the United States is completely indebted, every one of those countries in European Union. So there comes a moment in the history of the empires when they realize that is more expensive to maintain them than to abandon them. And that's what happened with the French Empire under General de Gaulle, when he realized that it's just too costly and it just drags France down to maintain its African empire, and they just abandoned it. The same thing happened with the British Empire, except that the British didn't want to abandon it, but they couldn't afford it. They just couldn't afford to keep it, even though they wanted to, and they just kind of let it go. In some ways, the dissolution of the Soviet Union also is the abandonment of the empire, because the maintaining of the republics was quite expensive for the Russia Federation, and Russia felt itself unburdened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it began to build new type of relationships with the former Soviet republics. Well, the United States is in a similar situation. The informal American empire, when it had, it still does, bases all over the world to maintain its military presence. It seems to me that Trump is beginning to understand that is counter to the interests of the United States. It seems like in the America Firsters, in his MAGA movement, there are those like Vice President Vance who argue that the America First means that American national interests have to come before the interests of others, and that means America's business is business. It has to develop its business presence in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It has to compete with China, not fight it militarily. It has to establish a good relationship with Russia so that they could develop the Arctic together and have a rapprochement in energy industries and in many other aspects. It seems like Trump is like dual nature. On the one hand, he grabs on to he's pulled back to it by his establishment, which is globalist and imperialist. And on the other hand, he is drawn to a new approach. And that is to take a rightful place of the United States in the new global order of multipolarity. Thank you very much. I hope you'll subscribe, and I'll see you soon with a new edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin.